Also around the turn of the century, starting in about 1890, so we're still in the closing decades of the 19th century, but then through the beginning of the 20th century, we have the emergence of the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era is a period of widespread social activism and political reform across the United States that spanned the 1890s to the 1920s. The main objectives of the progressive movement were addressing what they viewed as the theoretical problems caused by industrialization, urbanization, as well as corruption in the government. And then they also argued for some sort of what they would call immigration reform as well. But this was a little bit complicated. They also supported aspects of prohibition, education improvements. Now this is broadly construed the progressive movement. I want to make a distinction here. There is a progressive era. There is a progressive movement. There are progressives, and there is a progressive party. Not all of those are the same. The progressive era is the era in question. The progressive movement is a very specific political movement. The progressive party has a specific political platform that does not necessarily agree with the progressive movement. Then progressives themselves are actually incredibly intellectually diverse and include a broad swath of American society, all the way from the left to the right wing of American politics in the early 20th century. So I will trouble these perspectives a little bit by making them a little more nuanced, as historians say. The term here, theoretical problems, is quite important for the progressive movement, because this in fact points to the idea that some of the points of the progressive platform were not actually problems, right? So, for example, there was this idea that alcohol was an inherent social ail and was an inherent problem for American society. So a part of the progressive platform supported prohibition. Now, as we know from later periods of U.S. history, when you ban a controlled substance, you just create a criminal market, right? So if you ban alcohol, you just create a market, a black market for alcohol. If you ban marijuana, as happens over the course of the early 20th century, increasingly criminalized, well, create a market for it. If you ban cocaine, then you create a black market for it, right? And of course, as we know from the period of alcohol prohibition, most famously, those strict government controls also lead to violence between the state and the individuals who are attempting to control the black market. Now, more broadly here, there are elements of the progressive movement that pick up the strain of the populist movement, and they target the breakup of the so-called political machines as a pro-democracy platform. Probably most individuals taking this class would say, hey, that's probably a good thing. Right? They also supported trust busting, or this idea that you would essentially break up massive vertical and de facto horizontal monopolies. Most people probably say, okay, well, that's probably a good thing. Prohibition probably doesn't fly as well in New Orleans influenced culture of Louisiana as other areas, but it's important to note that historically aspects of the KKK in Louisiana and also the Democratic Party attempted to use this prohibition argument to try and co-opt some of the progressive energy. So that's a little bit of the local flair there as well that makes the Louisiana political situation, also the case in Mississippi and Alabama, that's quite distinct from what's going on in the upper Midwest during those same debates. They did support women's suffrage across the board. Now, of course, you have elements of the progressives, like aforementioned Susan B. Anthony, who supports women's suffrage, but doesn't really need to support racial equality or desegregation or the right of women of color to vote. She just says all women need to be able to vote, but completely ignores the segregation issue, right? So it's de facto throwing women of color under the bus there. Nonetheless, you do have other advocates for women's suffrage, like Ida B. Wells, clearly support women's suffrage for all women. Another aspect of the progressive era is the efficiency movement, which is actually kind of sort of proto-authoritarian in its control of the workplace. Now, this is based off of what's called Taylorism. It's really incremental control of the workplace. So if anybody has ever had to clock in and out of the workplace, that's an aspect of that has stuck around, but it's not as common today as it was in the 1980s and 1990s, for example, when I was working in restaurants when I was younger, and still in the 2000s actually, had to clock in and out of the restaurant with a punch card. So this you might see in contemporary examples in Amazon is a good example of the efficiency movement. So you get a task in one of these massive warehouses. You have to go find the package. You've got about a minute and a half to go find the package. You go find the package, you scan the package, then you've got about a minute and a half to get the package down and get the package onto a workbench and into another sort of area where it's going to be shuttled off into another section of the warehouse, and then scan the package again, and then you've got another 30 seconds before you look at the list, and all of that is timed. And it's incredibly brutal to break up the workday like this. Part of the irony of the efficiency movement is that many of this sort of authoritarian control of the workplace policies actually end up making workers less efficient. But nonetheless, it's sort of this movement that's important politically in the progressive era. Unquestionably, everybody's going to agree that public education is generally a good thing, right? Obviously, this is a public university, right? Students go to public schools. The whole idea of public schools, the push for public schools, the push for broader literacy comes from, at first, socialists and populists, but then gets incorporated into the progressive movement. And this is broadly construed. Basically, people are going to look at this and say, okay, yeah, that's a societal good for the progressive era, right? Then, of course, immigration issues. Now, they're going to argue that there are immigration reforms and that immigration causes problems. What they're ignoring is that immigration does not actually inherently, from the historical evidence we have, cause problems. It's actually net benefit for the American economy. It produces economic growth. Immigration does. So if you want the American economy to grow, well, the historical evidence says increase immigration. So that's something that's quite notable. But the progressives are arguing that immigration leads to these individuals who are uneducated and don't speak English and aren't assimilated and not like the rest of Americans, and they need to be educated and washed and properly sanitized and so forth. So there's this element of the progressive era which is actually supporting increased immigration restrictions, which then becomes that actually creates more problems. The immigration restrictions creates more problems moving onward. Also during this period, you have the expansion of Chinese exclusion into an Asiatic barred zone. So barring all individuals from Asia from entering the United States, an incredibly racist policy, not just incredibly racist, but with long-standing implications. For example, the Asian American population of the United States is disproportionately small because of this decades and decades and decades of racist policy. In fact, you could argue, and many people have argued, that any immigrant who is from the families who are previously excluded, who is paying immigrant fees in the middle of the 20th century or after that, is paying still for the previous segregation in immigration. So that's something to keep in mind moving forward in terms of lasting implications on American society, which will be made into discussions later. It is part of the legacy of the progressive era, a complicated legacy to say the least. Some parts good, some parts troubling. Also around the 1890s through the turn of the century, you have shifts in American politics due to assassinations. The first is the assassination of President Garfield, which took place in Washington, D.C. at 9:30 a.m. on Saturday, July 2nd of 1881, less than 4 months after he took office. Charles J. Guiteau shot him twice, once in his right arm and once in his back, with a .442 Webley British Bulldog revolver as the president was arriving at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad station. Garfield died 11 weeks later on September 19th of 1881 of complications caused by infections, which is an incredible way to suffer over the course of several months. Guiteau was arrested, and after a highly publicized trial lasting from November to January 25th of 1882, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. A subsequent appeal was rejected, and he was executed by hanging on June 30th of 1882 in the District of Columbia, 2 days before the first anniversary of the assassination. Guiteau was assessed during his trial as mentally unbalanced and possibly suffering from some kind of bipolar disorder from the effects of syphilis on the brain. He claimed to have shot Garfield out of disappointment for being passed over for an appointment for ambassador to France. So if you think about this compared to, for example, Lincoln's assassination, it's kind of almost petty in a way. Not to say that Lincoln's assassination was not petty, that certainly was, but it's going to contrast and then shape the impressions of later assassinations. So, something to note here moving forward is the assassination of President McKinley is quite different from these previous two examples. Now, McKinley was famous for his pro-business policy. He supported the policies of these robber barons. He supported their rights to make money, to have their independent businesses, never mind if there were children dying in the factories and so forth, and women dying in the factories, and young men being injured on the job site. That didn't matter. The whole point was for the capitalists to make money. This upset a number of individuals, including Leon Czolgosz, who was an anarchist. The assassination of President McKinley took place at 4 p.m. on Friday, September 6, 1901, at the Temple of Music in Buffalo, New York. McKinley, attending the Pan American Exposition, was shot twice in the abdomen at close range by Leon Czolgosz, who was a self-proclaimed anarchist with a .32 caliber revolver wrapped up in what seemed to be a bandage. Now, the first bullet, luckily for McKinley, ricocheted off of either a button or maybe a medal that he was wearing. But the second shot hit him in the stomach. McKinley then died 7 days later on September 14th of 1901 after his medical conditions rapidly declined. Now, members of the crowd immediately captured and subdued Czolgosz. Afterward, the 4th Brigade of the National Guard, Signal Corps, and police also intervened in a potential protest and riot that was emerging, from their records at least, riot within quotes here, and they beat Czolgosz so severely that it was initially thought he might not live to stand trial. On September 24th, after a rushed 2-day trial in state court, Czolgosz was sentenced to death. He was then executed by electric chair in Auburn Prison on October 29th of 1901. Now, Czolgosz's actions were clearly politically motivated, although the outcome remains unclear, and it remains a little bit unclear on what outcome he hoped to achieve because the trial was so rushed. Following the assassination of President McKinley, Congress directed the Secret Service to protect the President of the United States as part of its mandate for every president moving forward. Additionally, a Ashkenazi Jew, Emma Goldman, was arrested on suspicion of being involved in the assassination. Emma Goldman was famously an advocate for revolutionary anarchism and also revolutionary socialism. Nonetheless, the fact that she was also Jewish was used against her to slander her, right? Sort of anti-Semitic spheres of being radically left and Jewish and so forth. We would see such anti-Semitism emerge later in Nazi Germany, beginning with the same sort of smears at first, attacking the radical leftists who happened to be Jewish, and then anti-Semitism is embedded within that, right? And radical leftists there is in quotes, because really, I mean, who's the radical here? The individual who's supporting the policies of children dying in factories, or the individual who's saying, maybe we should have some democracy for workers, right? That's kind of the question moving forward for the people who are reading about this in the papers, looking at the scene, right? So you have to think about that sort of contestation to understand the foment. Now, Emma Goldman, as I mentioned, was arrested on suspicion of being involved in the assassination. She later incurred a great deal of negative publicity when she published The Tragedy of Buffalo, and in the article she compared Czegolsz to Marcus Junius Brutus, the killer of Julius Caesar, and called McKinley the president of money, kings, and trust magnates. And she only really incurred this criticism not from supporters of her or from supporters of workers or working peoples, but from political elites and people who controlled the money. Other anarchists and radicals were unwilling to support Goldman's effort to aid Czegolsz, however, because they feared a brutal state reprisal, believing that he had harmed the movement, and they sort of retreated into the background. And there was indeed, in the following years, a brutal crackdown on anarchists and arrests of anarchists, beating of them, and so forth, even those who were not advocating for revolutionary anarchism. Now, of course, when pro-business McKinley is assassinated, the individual who takes the presidency is Teddy Roosevelt, an individual who has been sort of lionized for his impact on American society, and again, I will show has a nuanced record of benefits and detriments that follows him. For example, previously mentioned impact on the use of prison labor in the state of New York. His backing of that has been widely construed as a detriment to the state of New York. Nonetheless, McKinley and Roosevelt are relatively successful politicians around the turn of the century, and it's important to note sort of the trajectory of American politics here. So for your post, go ahead and look at these three electoral maps and see if you can note just one thing about them. You could note one thing about 1896, one thing about 1900, or one thing about 1904. You could create three separate threads, just contribute to one thread, and then a fourth thread could be the comparison. What's the bigger trajectory here and why? And what are you noticing about that trajectory moving forward? Go ahead and make a short post, and let's move on.